Hello and welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday and I'm Ariela Karmel. I'm speaking today with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. Hi, Lazar. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, Ariela.
In an apparent first, Israel striked Houthi-controlled Hodeidah port from sea rather than air in what the IDF said were strikes in response to recent missile and drone attacks on Israel. The activist boat that tried to break Israel's naval blockade of the Gaza Strip was also intercepted by the Israeli Navy early on Monday morning, reaching Ashdod port later in the evening. The detained activists, including climate activist Greta Thunberg, were detained by police and are now en route, apparently, to their home countries. So today we're going to discuss a number of things. We'll begin with new developments on the Iranian nuclear talks. Then we'll discuss Lazar's recent trip to Gaza, in which he toured a Hamas high command tunnel underneath a hospital. And finally, we'll discuss a new report revealing that the Prime Minister approved multi-million-dollar defense deals between Israeli companies and Qatar. All of this and more when we're back.
The law basically assumes that the enemy force you are fighting may not care about your civilians, but it certainly cares about its own civilians. What do we do in a reality where you're dealing with an enemy that the suffering of their civilian population is inherent to their war strategy? Now, that doesn't absolve us of our obligations. Hamas's inhumanity does not absolve us of the obligation for humanity. But the context that it creates, I think, is critical to the conversation, and it's very lacking.
I agree, but when democracies fight back against terror groups, they have to fight on two fronts. They have to both fight on the terms that have been laid out by the terror group, and the second thing you have to fight back is by preserving the norms of a democracy. We're forced to ask these moral questions about what we are and what we do, but based on an enemy that is not playing by the rules. But that's what we decide to be a part of by being the family of nations. And as Jews, we say, like every morning in our prayers, we say, Anachnu Amcha b'nei britecha. We choose to be the people of God's covenant, meaning we tie ourselves to an aspiration of justice and righteousness.
I'm Ariela Karmel here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S. President Donald Trump held a 40-minute phone call on Monday evening, shortly after Iran announced that it would soon respond to Washington's latest proposal for a nuclear deal. Lazar, what can you tell us about the status of these talks right now and what exactly is going on here?
Sure. So first of all, Ariela, is your first time hosting the podcast? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so congratulations. I'm honored to be your first guest. And we have some important issues to talk about. Obviously, the Iran nuclear issue is one that has been something that has dominated Israeli headlines and world headlines, actually, for over a decade. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been the crucial figure in warning the world about the dangers of that eventuality. Now, President Trump, let's remember, is the one who pulled out of the 2015 JCPOA that President Obama signed with Iran. And he is determined to sign a better deal. That seems quite difficult because there has been so much enrichment and so much advance and progress in the Iranian program since then. And it's really hard to imagine that Iran would accept anything that would amount to a much stricter deal than the JCPOA. But here we are. There's been 5 rounds of talks between the two sides. And Trump administration has kind of gone back and forth on whether the key issue of uranium enrichment on Iranian soil will take place. Iran says that's a red line. They have every right to enrich on their soil, and they won't give up that right. And you even heard that from the supreme leader. But in general, especially recent comments have indicated from Trump that there won't be uranium enrichment on Iranian soil. That is something that Israel is also extremely concerned about. Now, there were reports last week that said there's this kind of interim bridging proposal that for a limited amount of time, Iran, through an international consortium of Gulf Arab states and the U.S., will be able to enrich on its soil to 3%, nowhere near what it has reached now. That report has been denied, but that points at the heart of the issue right now, that America is trying to reach a deal in which Iran gives up any enrichment on its soil and opens up its sites in exchange for sanctions relief, and Iran is holding to its right, quote unquote, to enrich. Now, Trump and Netanyahu had that call last night. There wasn't much said about the call. Trump said it was a very good call, in kind of his free-flowing comments to reporters from Washington. And afterward, the prime minister's office released a readout that really didn't say much. It said they discussed, that Trump updated him, that there would be another round of talks. It's not sure when these talks are. Trump says Thursday, but it's probably going to be over the weekend. That'll be the 6th round of talks. So that's where things stand now. Of course, hovering over all of this is whether there will be an Israeli attack. Obviously, it's something that Israel wants Iran to feel threatened by, and feels like that can that push them into an acceptable deal for Israel. And then the question, of course, at what point, if at all, does President Trump, the same person who promised he would not enter new Middle Eastern wars, will he actually take any action against Iran, or will Iran succeed in stringing along these talks, something it feels that it will protect it from any Israeli attack? As long as it's talking in some way to the Trump administration, Israel will not be in a position to attack.
Do you have a sense right now as to how aligned Israel and the U.S. are in terms of what they're looking for in this deal and what they're willing to accept from Iran? Because it does seem like it's a major goal for the American administration to reach a deal regardless. Trump has said that emphatically, of course, with various conditions being met. But are you seeing any daylight in terms of American and Israeli goals and cooperation on this end?
Yeah, I'd say there was daylight from the very beginning. If you remember that April trip to the White House, where we were in Hungary with the prime minister, and then he was summoned right before Pesach, right before the Passover holiday, to the White House, and Netanyahu was basically ambushed. I was, 10 feet away from them, and Trump announces that there's going to be direct talks with Iran over the nuclear issue, in front of all the press, ambushed him on a couple of other things as well. So there's been daylight from the very start. Both sides continue to insist that, they're working together, they're fully coordinated, but they can't really hide the fact that there are very, very different priorities right now. The Trump administration, and Trump himself, really, that's what drives the administration, of course, wants to prove that his own personal diplomacy, his personal willingness to talk to anybody and everybody is what can wind down wars. But we haven't seen any success so far. We haven't seen it on the Ukraine issue. We haven't seen it on the Gaza issue. We haven't seen it on Iran. And the question is, how will that affect Trump's approach to these talks? Will he be fed up and say he has to make an example of somebody? Or will he say, oh, I need one win, and the easiest win right now is Iran? And that will really put him at odds with what Netanyahu and much of the Israeli establishment sees as the core security threat to Israel.
Gotcha. We're going to go to a short break now. Thanks, Lazar.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life, and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up, and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
And we're back. I'm Ariela Karmel here with our diplomatic reporter, Lazar Berman. The army in Shin Bet confirmed on Sunday that a body extracted by Israeli forces in a tunnel in southern Gaza over the weekend was that of Hamas leader Muhammad Sinwar. This announcement came just hours after our very own Lazar Berman accompanied the IDF into Gaza. Lazar, tell us about what your experience was like with the army in Gaza.
Yep. So as this isn't at all my first time in Gaza, not as a reservist or as a journalist. This is probably as a journalist, I'm probably 10th time going in. Of course, our intrepid military reporter, Manny Fabian, I don't even know how many times it's been at 30. And of course, I finished reserve duty only the week before, but I was in Rafah. So Khan Yunis, I have not been in since this Gideon's Chariots operation started in March. What struck me at first was the fact that this was the first area I've been in where a relatively high proportion of the homes were still standing in some way. The damage here was much less, and that's because this is the first time the IDF has operated in force in this area. Now, we reached with the Sayeret Golani under the 36th Division. We reached this hospital called the European Hospital because it was built with funds from the EU. In cooperation with UNRWA. And not surprisingly, Hamas built one of its main tunnels underneath this hospital. It's a massive tunnel network, and believe me, it goes right under the hospital. We were at the entrance to the emergency room. Israel dug a kind of steep pit into the tunnel, and you could see how the tunnel runs right under the emergency room. Now, this tunnel was significant because Muhammad Sinwar, who was the Hamas military leader after the death of his brother Yahya Sinwar last year, was hiding in there. First of all, he used it as one of his main command posts. There was command from the October 7th attacks and the fighting against Israel since then. And this was where Muhammad Sinwar and a couple of other senior leaders, a brigade commander, a battalion commander, and 2 others met their deaths on May 13th. That attack was a precision strike by Israel on 2 points in the tunnel outside of the hospital complex to trap the terror leaders inside. Officers I spoke to there said that they died from the fumes. They basically choked to death. But only 3 weeks later, on Saturday, this past Saturday, was Israel able to actually go into the tunnel and extract the bodies. And while I was there, the process of identifying the bodies was still ongoing. And a couple hours after I got out, they confirmed that this was indeed Muhammad Sinwar. Now, just a word, I'm sorry, a lot of people are eating breakfast probably when they listen to this podcast. So I won't go into too much detail, but let me emphasize the fact that those bodies were there for 3 weeks in a tunnel. They were only pulled out the day before I was there. Confined space. I put on 2 COVID masks. Obviously
Wasn't
the
enough,
smell,
I'm sure.
it was not even close enough. The smell was unbearable. My stomach's been kind of turned over for the past 2 days, and I've seen a thing or two, but this was something else. So we have video up there. That's about as much I'm going to say about that, but just to get a sense of the conditions. Of course, I have no sympathy for Hamas leaders dying in those conditions. But of course, you think about our hostages, and when they're in these tiny tunnels, you think of what they're going through, and that's something that obviously went through my head. I'll just say that some of the officers I spoke to, kind of tactical officers from Sayeret Golani, said that they believe that hostages were at some point in these very tunnels and that they found some forensic evidence tied to the hostages. No one thinks the hostages are anywhere close by right now. They seem to be more in central Gaza, the areas where the IDF has not yet reached in this current campaign.
So is there any idea as to which hostages were held there or when hostages were last held there? You mentioned forensic evidence. Is that something that has been publicly released at all?
Only that's as much as they would say. They didn't want to go into any details for obvious reasons. But the sense I got was that it was earlier in the war, not any time recently.
And was this your first time observing or actually entering Hamas tunnels in Gaza, or you've done that prior to?
No, I've done that before. I don't remember being in a network this large, but yeah, I was in a tunnel under Nitzarim with 646. And I've been in some other tunnels as well. Even before the war, there were some tunnels, if you remember, those attack tunnels that went under the border and into Israel. So Israel would open those up occasionally for scholars and for journalists as well. So this is not the first time, but this is the first time I've been in one that had 5 bodies in it for 3 weeks, and I was in it the next day. So definitely a different experience in that regard.
And my understanding is the rationale behind bringing in journalists to view this tunnel and the significance of it wasn't simply that Hamas high command, including Muhammad Sinwar's bodies, were found there, they were murdered there, but that this is an example of a tunnel sitting underneath a hospital, a European-funded hospital, that was being used by Hamas high command, and I think the army believes is also one of the areas from which the October 7th attacks were launched, essentially. Is that
for
correct?
sure. Yeah, for sure. You see, I mean, the day after the bodies were pulled out, they had, I don't know, 10 Israeli military correspondents in there. Well, 9 plus me. I'm a diplomatic. And more interestingly, after we left, the international press went in. So you can see the New York Times had a piece there as well. So the senior international press also was taken in there a day after Muhammad Sinwar was killed out. Of course, the emphasis was, look, a hospital. By the way, the hospital buildings are still standing. Israel says, when this is over, that hospital can go back to operation with some minor repairs. Hospital still standing. It was operating until a few weeks ago, but there was a tunnel underneath, and there was no way that the management of the hospital had no idea. An extensive tunnel network, a command post, a central command post, intentionally built under a hospital. I'm sure that is what Israel wanted to stress to the world.
So finally, Lazar, I do want to discuss a report that was recently published that you wrote about as well, detailing massive deals that were approved by Prime Minister Netanyahu between top Israeli defense companies and Qatar. Can you tell us about the details of this report and what everyone should know?
Yeah, so this is kind of the Qatar conundrum. Little alliteration there. What is Qatar, and how should we approach it? Is it a moderate state that just wants to kind of bridge some of the more problematic elements in the region with the West, and it wants to just build up its own reserves and its own funds, and it wants to be the mediator for the Middle East, and a country that has had long-standing ties with Israel going back to the 1990s? Or is it a central link in the terror axis in the Middle East, not only the Muslim Brotherhood one, but also perhaps the Iranian one? So that's the question right now. Of course, we have treated Qatar as the former, a central piece of the mediation talks, one of the main mediators, and sometimes the main mediator. And also, of course, over the years, we asked them to send money to Hamas, through it's an Israeli initiative, Israeli approval. And that is something that we're still not sure, how we should be treating Qatar going forward. And making this even more complicated is the fact that there is an ongoing investigation into Qatari influence into some of Prime Minister Netanyahu's advisors. So then there's a question of how much undue influence it had over Israeli decision-making. There's been 2 reports this week. The one from this morning, reported in Walla, was that Netanyahu and the defense ministry and the foreign ministry signed off on major defense deals in recent years with Qatar. We're talking about Rafael, Elbit, IAI, including trips by senior executives to Qatar. You had a senior Qatari delegation visit IAI for a day. And these were, of course, all signed off. As I said, they were approved. So why are we selling advanced technology to a country that is in touch with Hamas and seems to be supporting Hamas? And that ties in to a report from, I believe it was yesterday, in which there was deeper talks and ties between Qatar than we had previously reported. There was conversations between senior Hamas leaders, between Sinwar and Hania, which talked about Hamas as the prime artery, the main artery for Hamas funding. And also a meeting which included Hamas, in which there was discussions with Qatar about training Hamas fighters, maybe in Qatar, maybe in Turkey, and also incorporating Palestinians in Lebanon into Hamas units in Lebanon. So that is beyond any sort of, financial support for Hamas's civil governance, but actually quiet support, maybe support that Israel didn't know about, for its terror network. And that is something that should paint Qatar in a totally different light. So you put these two reports together, add them to the reports that we know about influence in Prime Minister's office, and its problematic role as a mediator. And I think we really have to have tough questions. Hopefully, once the hostages are out, then we can come up with a strategy for combating Qatari influence and really seeing it for the problematic actor that it is.
Thank you so much, Lazar. We're going to close on that note. Thank you to everyone who's listening to this episode of the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please send us an email at podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next time, have a great day.